Welcome to the Ignatius Press podcast. I'm your host, Andrew Petiprin, joined today by Dale Ahlquist, who is president of the Society of Gilbert Keith Chesterton. He's also the creator and host of the long-running EWTN series on G.K. Chesterton and publisher of Gilbert magazine. He is considered the greatest living authority on the life and works of Chesterton. His books include The Apostle of Common Sense, The Complete Thinker, Night of the Holy Ghost, and Common Sense 101, available from Ignatius Press now. And today we're discussing his new book from Ignatius Press, which is a particularly interesting one. I was drawn in by the title immediately and couldn't wait to pick it up, and I know our listeners and viewers will feel the same way. The book is called I Also Had My Hour, an alternative autobiography of G.K. Chesterton. Dale Ahlquist, welcome to the podcast. How are you?
Thank you so much, Andrew. A great pleasure to be with you.
Well, it's a great pleasure for me to get to talk to you as a great admirer of G.K. Chesterton and someone who is certainly well aware of your tireless advocacy of him and of his works. This new book is something, I have to say. I have never yet picked up a book that has the word alternative in the title of an autobiography. Now, G.K. Chesterton did write an autobiography. I have to say, I have not actually read it, although I have read most of his other works. How is it that we're now putting out an alternative autobiography? Tell us about this.
Yeah, why would anyone be puzzled by a subtitle like that? Isn't that the most self-explanatory thing? Yeah, it was meant to be a catchy subtitle, but in this case, it's not just catchy, it is accurate. Chesterton did, as you point out, write an autobiography. It was actually the last book he ever wrote. It was published just after his death. And it was well received, but there was one major criticism of it, and that continues to be a criticism today, even to people who still read it and enjoy it. And that is that he left the main character out of his autobiography. He tended to write about all the people he knew. He does give some personal stories and personal insights and reflections and memories. But for the most part, he's writing about everything except himself, which is typical of the man himself. Very humble. And even though he would tend to draw a lot of attention to himself, he did not enjoy the attention. He was trying to point to something beyond himself. And so what we did with this book, and I guess what has been the great project, because it's something I've been working on for literally decades, is we've taken Chesterton's own words and I've created a narrative of his life in his own words where we do catch him unawares writing about himself. And so he was primarily an essayist, and I sort of gave myself the restriction that for almost the entire book, I don't quote from his other books. Those are the writings that people should be familiar with, and even if they're not, those books are available. But his essay writing, his newspaper articles, really comprise the majority of his writing throughout his life. He made his living as a journalist, and most biographers, most scholars tend to overlook the great bulk of his work. In fact, Ian Carr, who wrote a massive biography of Chesterton, admits right in the opening chapter, I really haven't dealt with his journalism at all. Well, that's just a wealth of information. That's his daily writing is what it is. And that's where he tends to tell anecdotes about himself, and he shares memories of his youth. And so I had the great pleasure of studying Chesterton for years and pulling all that together.
You also, Dale, draw from his speeches, which I know that's another whole area of Chesterton's output, which was a huge part of his life. I mean, this is something that comes out in this very extended timeline, and we're going to talk about that more in just a moment. But you see in the timeline of his life, night after night after night after night, he's out giving speeches. And naturally, in those speeches, he's going to talk about himself a little bit because you just have to do that when you speak, don't you? So tell us about how you use the speeches.
Yeah, thanks for bringing that up, because most people, scholars, students of Chesterton have overlooked his speeches simply because there's so few transcripts of them available. But what there are are newspaper reports of him, where he's quoted extensively. The speech is quoted extensively in the newspaper article. And that became just a huge new source of Chesterton material. When I started discovering the amount of speeches that were covered in newspapers, it just opened up a whole new world of Chesterton for me. Discovering all of his essays when I was still very young and discovering Chesterton for the first time, that was huge. That was like finding lost scripture in the bowels of old libraries, finding this stuff. But the speeches became a whole extra source of material. And you're right. He always will start a speech with a personal anecdote or some self-deprecating comment that leads to what his point is going to be in the speech. And literally thousands of speeches that we're drawing from.
Yeah. You mentioned before that, this was a labor of love that took you many years. And, the thing that struck me when I read the book, Dale, was just how it really does read like a coherent narrative. It reads like an autobiography. And yet, when you read through it, you see, there'll be one paragraph and a footnote, another paragraph and a footnote. So, you were literally taking a bit of a speech, a bit of an article, a bit of this, and you're stringing it all together. What was that process like for you? How did you figure that out so that it fit together like it meant to go together?
Oh, thank you for saying that. That's very gratifying to hear. The first idea of alternative autobiography came from just gathering little tidbits of Chesterton's lines about himself that appeared throughout his writings, and we would print those in Gilbert magazine, the Society of Chesterton's publication. But before that, there was just a little stapled newsletter called Midwest Chesterton News, and the editor was a gentleman named John Peterson, and he was the one who actually first started a little feature of 5 or 6 or 8 quotes, and he called it Fragments of an Autobiography. And then I would start to notice those, so I'd start sending him some quotes. And then when the magazine took over after the newsletter, I just kept that feature going. We call it GKC on GKC. And at a certain point, I realized there's quite a bit of material here, enough for several pages. And when we gathered enough material, I said, well, listen, I'll bet there's more. And then I started reading in a more purposeful way to pull out personal stories. And then not only realizing that we were going to have enough for a book, we decided another project I've been working on was the timeline, and those two would go together very well.
Well, I'm glad you brought up the timeline. I really want to talk to you about that because I was so drawn in by this timeline. For those who haven't yet had a chance to pick up the book, there is a detailed timeline of Chesterton's life that runs, I believe, Dale, 140 pages of the book. So, we're really getting into the day-to-day life of G.K. Chesterton. And I was absolutely riveted by this. I have a bit of a voyeuristic nature or something like that. But just to see day to day people he met, trips he took, illnesses he suffered from and recovered from, movies he saw, plays that he attended, all these sorts of things. To me, stuff like that is so important for understanding kind of what goes into making the person who creates the work that we appreciate. So, was it fun for you to compile that? It seems like it would be. Tedious, but the things that you got to kind of put in front of us must have been kind of interesting choices.
I never thought of it as tedious even once. It was just a joy to see it get built up. And it was a suggestion of a great Chestertonian over in England named Aidan Mackey, who passed away a couple years ago at the age of 101 and a half. But he said years ago, someone should put together a timeline of Chesterton's life. And, I started to just do it. And, I remember when it was 20 pages, I said, oh man, this is a pretty good timeline here. And then continued to find great sources of material, including a visit to the Chesterton Library, as it was then called, in Oxford. And now that collection has moved to Notre Dame's London Gateway campus, and it's called the Chesterton Collection. But that had some wonderful original material, including we found Dorothy Collins's date books, that she was the secretary to Chesterton for the last several years of his life. And we must have found at least 8 or 12 of those. And those are just the daily appointments and with no narrative at all. Just saying, this is who you're meeting with this day. But that's where we learned that Sigrid Undset visited Chesterton in England, that was a huge, huge discovery. Nobel Prize winning writer who was a Catholic convert in connection with Chesterton, who translated The Everlasting Man into Norwegian. So
wow.
that was a big discovery. So building the timeline was a great joy, and to find new holes to plug. Again, newspaper articles would report a meeting that he had with someone, or a public event, and said who was there, and that's how I found out that Chesterton met Bram Stoker, the author of Dracula.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah, there are a lot of names that pop up in the timeline. I was sort of really interested to see which ones popped up. And obviously one that popped up is Hilaire Belloc, because, that he's a major figure connected to Chesterton, and a major figure in his own right, obviously. So Chesterton talks about him in lots of places in the autobiographical material that you've compiled. But I was really struck that he popped up in the timeline. A fact that I just didn't know before was in the timeline, you show us an entry there on December 24th, 1900. Chesterton attends his first Catholic Mass with Hilaire Belloc. And it's going to be 22 years later that Chesterton becomes a Catholic. But let's start there, maybe, to kind of get into what he tells us about his own process of becoming Catholic. Like, what an interesting little tidbit of information that years and years before he became Catholic, he meets this guy, Hilaire Belloc, and goes to Mass with him.
Yeah, that was a wonderful discovery, to find out that was the earliest Catholic Mass he went to, and it was with Belloc. It was a Catholic it was Christmas midnight Mass. That was great. But you see where the timeline shows the key people that he meets in his life before his conversion really play a role in the deepening of his religious faith. He clearly, if you read his writings, he's really well formed right at the beginning. He's already defending the Catholic Church as early as 1903. But you see the players. It was 1902 when he met Father O'Connor, who became the inspiration for the Father Brown character, and 1900 meeting Belloc, and those two figures are probably the most important in him becoming Catholic. But then his great friend Maurice Baring also played a role. He himself was a convert, and so you see how long he knew Maurice Baring as well. And then I do have one chapter, of course, of the book is devoted to write what he writes about his conversion, and what's different from that chapter from his other writings on his conversion is these were mostly from newspaper interviews, and he went a lot deeper into it and more personal in these interviews than he did when he actually sat down to write about his conversion.
Why do you think that's the case? Did he not really think of himself as somebody who needed in his writing to kind of apologize for the Catholic faith as much as maybe others did, but it was yet something he was very happy to talk about when asked about it? Is that the way you would think of it?
I do. I think he never would turn down a question if asked, but when he had to sit down and write about his conversion, he's a little bit, gives a little more information in the autobiography than he does in the other major book he wrote, which is called The Catholic Church and Conversion. And in that book, he basically says, I'm not going to say that what I went through is typical of everyone who converts, but this is the process I think a lot of people go through. And indeed, most converts read that, they go, yeah, that's how it was for me too.
Mm-hmm.
And so there he is. He's not trying to talk about himself. He's trying to connect to universal thoughts that everybody can relate to. It just shows he cares more about a general idea or even a specific idea and not making it autobiographical. And so when he could avoid talking about himself, he always did.
Yeah. Yeah, that's very interesting. And, I was thinking about the circumstances of his conversion that, obviously he was a man of a later time than, say, John Henry Newman, and he also wasn't a clergyman. So, I mean, his conversion kind of had a different character compared to maybe other famous English converts. But it doesn't appear to be the case that he really lost any friends or followers because of his conversion, did he? I mean, it was something that he just integrated into this larger life, wasn't it?
Yeah, I think, that the joke I tell often is that when his conversion was announced in 1922, a lot of people were shocked because they thought he already was Catholic.
Right,
Yeah,
right.
yeah, he was defending the Catholic Church, very, very specifically in his writings. And at one point he said, I'm standing at the door ushering other people in without having entered myself. And that's true. Some of the famous converts before him were influenced by him before he became Catholic.
Yes,
And
certainly.
Ronald Knox is one of those people.
Yeah.
But the other interesting point about his conversion is that there were a few people who were shocked because he did become Catholic. They thought he was too smart to do something like that. His great intellectual opponent but personal friend, George Bernard Shaw, who used to make fun of Chesterton's Roman Catholic hobby, was what fired off a letter to him saying, "This is going too far, Gilbert. This is going too far."
Orthodoxy with a small o is one thing, but becoming a Roman Catholic is something else. Yeah,
that's exactly right.
That's very interesting.
There is no change in his writing or his style from his pre-conversion to his post-conversion. The only difference is that he does write more specifically about certain Protestant ideas and Protestant heresies, as it were.
Interesting. Yeah. I was struck, just to say one last thing about the conversion part before we get into some other topics, that I have to admit, I had never encountered the details of the actual conversion. I mean, that it took place in such a humble, kind of strange circumstance. And I wonder if other readers, maybe people just know more than I do, but I thought I was relatively well informed about Chesterton, and I didn't know about that. So I wonder if you could just say something about that and what his reflection on kind of this strange, humble circumstances of actually coming into the church were like.
Yeah, I think Chesterton addresses the fact that, if people say I was drawn to the Catholic Church because of its majestic beauty and just swept away by the magnificence of great Catholic architecture and music, so I could tell them that I was received into the Catholic Church in what was basically a tin shed. It was a building built onto the side of a hotel in the town of Beaconsfield. It was a temporary chapel while a Catholic church was going to be built there. It could not have been a more humble setting, and there's really no one there except his wife and two priests and just a few other people who happened to be, because it wasn't at a mass or anything, and that's where he made his profession of faith.
I think that's just extraordinary, and I loved learning that detail along with some others about his conversion that readers will discover. Let's talk about his travels a little bit. He went places. He went to lots of places, and I wasn't actually aware of all of this. He went to Poland, for example, and the impression I got was he was somewhat surprised to realize that his works were known there and that he was so appreciated there. He, of course, went to the United States, came to the United States at least a couple of times, I think, a couple of big trips.
Yes.
And likewise, was maybe somewhat surprised that as many people kind of turned up to find out what he had to say as they did. I wonder if you could just say something about his travels and what he says about traveling and what he encountered in places.
Yeah, when he was asked at the end of his first visit to the U.S., he said, what surprised you the most about America? The number of people who came to my lectures.
Yeah.
So he did travel extensively, at the later part of his life, because he had achieved worldwide fame by that point, and these lecture tours were, frankly, they were very profitable because he needed the money to run GK's Weekly. So he could have made a living easily just as a journalist, but he had to support a paper that he started. And he was always scrounging about for money for that, and that's really the reason for the second collection of the Father Brown stories. He wrote about 20 25 before his conversion. I mean, half the Father Brown stories were written before he became Catholic.
Yeah.
And but the second, actually, the three other books were specifically written to pay for the printing bills at GK's Weekly. So,
Wow.
as I said, a lot of people had to die to keep that newspaper. and so when he traveled, he would, as a speaker, he had a set number of lectures that he would recycle, but they, according to all accounts, they were always different, no matter whatever. But 3 different titles that he would use, and then he would just talk about whatever he want. And then the most interesting thing would be the Q&A afterwards, and people really enjoyed the interaction with him. But he was absolutely likable on the stage, and always, the big joke in America was that he wasn't as big as advertised. They expected a much fatter man because he had the reputation of being so big.
Yeah.
But he did sit on chairs on stage that would break under him.
Oh my goodness.
And he treated that as, that happens all the time.
It is, I don't know why it is, it seemed to me, Dale, kind of a funny thought to imagine this sort of, this Englishman in places like Louisville, Kentucky, or Nashville, Tennessee, or Tulsa, Oklahoma, or, these places where he went. And yet, in a way, I suppose I shouldn't be so surprised, because, I mean, maybe you're living proof of this. I am as well, that he's beloved in this country. Arguably, he's bigger in this country than he is anywhere else.
Yeah, it's true. America has a huge devotion to Chesterton, and that's been a real joy for me to experience as I travel around the country. It's just very warmly received.
Yeah, stuff like that really it really adds a lot to the narrative that you construct. These trips that he took. Let's talk about some of his views on things. I mean, one of the great things about an autobiography is that you kind of, if the man or the woman is being honest, one can see something of a development of the person's thought. And, Chesterton is known for advocating distributism, which is a very particular thing compared to some of the other maybe isms that other people of his age espoused. So I know that will be one of the things people are looking for when they pick up this book. So what does Chesterton say in the collection of writings you've assembled about distributism?
Well, the book does explain how he started out as a socialist, as many young men of his era, because they were so upset with the excesses of the Industrial Revolution and the huge disparity it caused in wealth, and also just the bad effect it had on urban areas and on people's lives and on the family. And so it was very common for young idealistic men, especially intellectuals, to embrace socialism. But then, after meeting Belloc, he discovered Pope Leo XIII, who had written the famous encyclical Rerum Novarum, which parentheses is the reason why Pope Leo XIV took the name Leo, specifically because of that encyclical. Well, here's an encyclical that had a huge effect on G.K. Chesterton. That's when you realize that there's an alternative to both industrial capitalism and socialism or communism, and that is for more people to become owners. That's exactly what the Pope says in his encyclical. And he even says the wrong reaction to capitalism is socialism. So he basically condemns both of these economic models as being anti-family, as being against the worker. And ownership is a natural thing. Thou shalt not steal would not be an ideal if ownership were not the norm. And Chesterton saw that solution. He and Belloc created this social theory that was neither capitalism nor socialism, but it's always accused of being one or the other. It's often accused of being socialist. Just it's so far from socialism, but because it's against big business, it's assumed to be socialism. And for the folks on the other end of the spectrum, because it's against socialism, it's assumed to be capitalism, right? And that's a very, Chester points out those are narrow and very recent ideas, both in terms of social philosophy and economics, which is itself a new science, right? And so but distributism is the name that Belloc came up with, and they knew it was not a good name. It was a confusing name, even if it was accurate in some sense, because it made a reference to Pope Leo's encyclical. It's simply not a good name. You have to start to always explain what it means, and by the time you've explained it, people are already not interested anymore. So we've come up with a new name called localism, and localism just hits it right away. People understand immediately what that means. It means keeping everything close to home, both your commercial interests and your political interests, and being more involved in both those things. So the Catholic social teaching is based on subsidiarity and solidarity. Subsidiarity is that mean you should have, that's local control right there. The things that affect you the most, you should have control of. And solidarity means that you're in it with everybody else who's doing the same thing. And solidarity, is what brought down the communist regime. That's what Poland did. So Chesterton and explains why the Poles liked Chesterton too, because they liked his social ideas. They loved his defense of the faith. They loved his defense of Poland as that it should be a local government and not run by some other country, right? So they were so celebratory when Chesterton came to Poland, because they were well read in his ideas before he got there.
Well, and he visited them at such an interesting time in their life. I mean, in between the world wars, where they had their own country briefly, and I would imagine then as the solidarity movement and the end of communism was drawing near, they might have looked back to that time and remembered Chesterton's presence in that time.
Oh, that would not surprise me one bit that there was still a memory of his visit and of the effect he had and the warm welcome he had. Because even in Spain, where he was also very celebrated, there's a huge Chesterton interest in Spain to this day that goes back to the time he visited Spain.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Something else that we find in this volume, in addition to kind of learning more about the development of his thoughts with regard to economics and social policy and his engagement with Catholic social teaching and all that, is more personal, which is the development of his own kind of literary imagination. We learn about sort of where he kind of got his ideas from. And I was struck, I probably should have known this as well, but I mean, I was struck by his confession about how little interest he had really in academic excellence as a young person, and sort of the way that he kind of described his his formation into what I would regard as sort of one of the great intellectual people of the 20th century. I mean, one of these sort of like major English intellectual figures, but he was not somebody who, for example, was like maybe C.S. Lewis, who was an Oxford man, or, he had a very different kind of trajectory, didn't he?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, if he didn't like school, he wasn't a good student. And he just basically somehow got through it, but he made some very good friends. And this group of young friends that they started a thing called the Junior Debating Club. And all of their pursuits, their hobby, were very intellectual. They would read, they would argue about great works of literature they read, but none of that showed up in his schoolwork at all. So I think of a Calvin and Hobbes cartoon where Calvin is just this expert on dinosaurs. He knows everything there is to know about dinosaurs because that's what a little boy does. He just focuses in on one thing that becomes his interest in his hobby. But in school, none of that shows up at all.
That really came through in what you've assembled. And having, like you, having been a little boy, this is so true. I mean, we become obsessed with certain things and experts in certain things that really have no outlet in the system, do they? And yet, Chesterton is such a great example of somebody who just took all of that and put it all together in a way that was such a blessing and a gift to other people eventually.
Yeah, absolutely. And his intellectual pursuits were nourished by a group of bright young men who shared these interests, but they immediately looked to him as the leader. He right away became the leader of the group. And I think the other interesting thing that came out of his schoolwork is that I was going to say that the fact that his principal told the parents don't bother sending him to the university. He's just not a very good student. It's impossible to teach him anything.
Mm-hmm.
But by not going to the university, that probably saved him a lot from having to fight against the university system, because that type of thinking was not his way of thinking at all.
Yeah. Although I imagine he would have done well at, say, the Oxford Union, debating people or something like that. There would have been aspects of university life that he would have done well in, but clearly basically the main reason for being there might have been a bit of an obstacle.
Yeah, that's what I think too. I think he would have had fun as a student, but not been a good student.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Let's touch on a couple of other topics here while we have the time. One of them, this is shifting gears quite dramatically, but I wanted to get to this, which is, oftentimes people raise the issue of anti-Semitism with G.K. Chesterton. And there's a whole chapter of this book that you've put together that's devoted to various questions around Jews and Judaism and that sort of thing. So what do we learn from this book about maybe, what people have wrong about that, what the misperceptions are? What do we learn here?
Yeah, it was good to be able to use Chesterton's own words to defend him against a charge that has existed. And he clearly had no animosity towards the Jews. There was no malicious feelings whatsoever. And it's wrong for people to accuse him of that. But what I did with the excerpts of his writings that I use is try to put it into context, how he felt about the Jews on a larger scale. He believed that that everyone is naturally patriotic, that that's a natural virtue in most people. But he said the problem with the Jews is that they were always outsiders in Europe, and their natural patriotism was towards their own people. This is his theory. So this is why he argued for the restoration of a Jewish homeland. And so he was very much a Zionist before there was any Zion. And, many Jews loved him for that and sought his support in getting a Jewish homeland restored. And that's so often overlooked. In fact, people say just the opposite. Well, he wanted a Jewish homeland because he wanted to get rid of the Jews. And that's just the farthest thing from the truth.
Right.
What he wanted the Jewish homeland for the good of the Jews. He did warn this: if this isn't solved, there's going to be an outbreak of violence against the Jews in Europe. And so he very much predicted what happened. He advocated a solution before it happened, and it's a tragedy that's been misrepresented.
Yeah, and it also raises an interesting what if of history, it seems to me, because he did live to see Hitler come to power in Germany, and he was not at all happy with that. But he did not live long enough to see the ravages of World War II. He did not live long enough to learn of the Holocaust and the near annihilation of the Jewish people. Now, I doubt, I want to get your thoughts on this. I mean, I doubt he would have, after the fact, looked back on the things he had written and said earlier and say, oh, I was totally wrong about everything. I think he defends himself perfectly well. There wasn't anything wrong about what he said. But I do wonder what he would have said in addition, in the after effects of this, cataclysm that he didn't live long enough to see.
Yeah. Well, the other thing that people really miss on Chesterton is how against German philosophy he was.
Yeah, interesting.
He says, the reason for these two world wars, I mean, he only lived through one of them, was that this is the philosophy that is so anti-Christian and anti-European, and it has to be stopped. It has to be stopped. And he takes apart German philosophy very well, but he also said at the end of World War I that the war wasn't over. That it was the problem with Germany has not been solved at all. And of course, it was the oppression of the Jews and also of the Poles. Let's remember they suffered under the Nazis as well. Was a natural result of a Nietzschean philosophy that looked at an overmass super race, which was the Aryans in the case of the Germans, and that they were destined to conquer because they were the best people. That Chesterton said that's such a poisonous philosophy, and we have to stop it. And so the Jews suffered particularly as a result of that German philosophy, but so did a host of other people, including several million Polish Catholics who were put to death in the
Yeah.
concentration camps too.
Yeah. Well, I think that for those who are genuinely interested in that question, and sadly, I think some people are interested in accusations and not so interested in information. But I think that people who really engage with that chapter and really read what he says, the words you've assembled, will really, I think, come away appreciating that Chesterton was in no way some kind of anti-Semite. Far from it.
It just goes completely against his character, which is that character is revealed throughout the book. How could something be that off character? And in case, as a fact, it isn't. Chesterton has just been. It's usually a bad sounding quote that's taken out of context that is used to accuse him and
make us think ill of him or something like that. Yeah. A couple of other things here. You've included some stuff in this alternative autobiography that we haven't seen before, at least probably many people haven't seen before, including a batch of poems. There's a batch of poems in here that I believe have never been published before. Is that correct?
No, they've been published, but most of them have never been collected.
I see.
That's why I haven't seen them. Yeah.
Well, tell us about those. Like, how did these poems? He was a great poet. Although I think probably a lot of his appreciators don't engage with his poetry as much as his other writings. But what do we learn about him through these poems that you've included in this book?
So when Chesterton died, some of the obituaries said he would be most remembered as a poet. It's so interesting. So his poetry was quite popular during his lifetime, and sold several volumes. And he wrote a great epic poem, "The Battle of the White Horse," and another smaller epic poem, "La Panta," which was very popular during his lifetime. But I chose some particular poems because they were autobiographical. And just as a side note, the title of the book, "I Also Had My Hour," is a line from one of his most famous poems, "The Donkey." And each chapter title is a line from that poem. The idea is that that famous poem is itself autobiographical. Chesterton would equate himself with the humility of a donkey, and yet this reviled creature, this stubborn creature, this laughed at creature did have his hour. It was recognized that he was carrying Christ. And that's really when Chesterton realizes that he's carrying Christ. He has great memories of the palms before his feet, as it were. So the poems I chose were about his own depression that he went through as a young man, where he actually contemplated suicide, and that there's a poem about that. There's a poem about his love for his wife, Frances, and that's the only time he ever talks about her is through the poetry that he writes for her or about her. But also, one of the poems is about her own hesitation to become a Catholic. And when she finally is received, which was 4 years after him, it's revealed that her hesitancy was in accepting the doctrine of the real presence. And when she finally does embrace that, that comes out in the poem. It's really nice. And then there's some wonderful reflections on old age, looking back on his life, those poems. So I wanted to show, obviously, how Chesterton was a master across all genres, but poetry was just essential to his writing, and the things he enjoyed most doing was writing poetry. And again, there are some things where he reveals about himself that he doesn't do anywhere else.
Yeah, that's very interesting. By the way, why, just speculate for me a little bit. Why do you think he didn't write about his wife and his marriage more?
Well, I would say two reasons. One, I'm sure she requested that don't write about me. I'm sure that's the number one reason. She enjoyed being in his shadow and being behind him. And she was amazed when she first came to America how the press wanted to interview her. That's just something she had not experienced before. And he said, "Why do you want to interview me?" "Well, because your husband's a famous man. That's why." And but then she revealed what a humble life they had together. They just lived in a normal house and had the same concerns as anybody else. But so that's the one. Certainly the one reason. But and he does make these side references to her as they bring out the footnotes where he talks about a woman I know very well, or
yes,
or someone who has a feminine perspective that I tend to take seriously. So he's making these coded references to his wife.
Yes.
He never says, "My wife Frances says."
Right.
It never comes out that way. So it's a respect for her privacy, but the other things about marriage is that that's the most personal part of your life, and the most personal things he's just very quiet about, and that's why it's been a great discovery to find some of those personal things about him, and they certainly don't reveal any scandals. That's for sure. They just affirm everything you've known about Chesterton.
Yeah. Well, and as much as we want to know everything, I suppose there's something valuable in coming away from a project even as thorough as yours and not knowing everything about the innermost depths of the man's life and heart, right?
Amen.
Let's wrap up on one other really interesting thing that you've included towards the end of the book, which is you made the point at the outset that the one thing that seemed to be missing from Chesterton's own autobiography was a reflection on himself. So you've included as a kind of long appendix, I guess. I mean, it's a chapter, but it's almost sort of, added on to the record that Chesterton himself gives of his life, a whole lot of sort of collections of like quotes, paragraphs, like information, testimonies from people who knew him. And I'd like to share just one and then maybe get your thoughts on kind of the whole thing. But I love this one that you found by Monsignor Charles Boldrick of the Archdiocese of Louisville, Kentucky in 1929. I picked this because, again, imagining Chesterton in this place is just kind of amusing to me. But Monsignor Boldrick said, "Everyone enjoyed him immensely. I was so glad to see and hear him, who I think is the outstanding Catholic writer of today. One of the world's great minds, perhaps the greatest convert since Newman. The Church is fortunate in calling him her son." What a wonderful testimony that someone gave. Tell us more about these testimonies, these reflections that you collected from these other people.
Yeah, so part of the reason for that chapter is payback, because Chesterton, refused to talk about himself in his autobiography. So here I'm going to bring in a few testimonies of people who will talk about him now, and really give him the praise that he deserves. And these are marvelous testimonies. And one of the things they bring out, quite frankly, is that they think Chesterton should be counted among the saints.
Mm-hmm.
And we believe that his cause could open pretty soon. We hope that this book will play a part in that, because the people who knew him intimately realized there was a holiness about him. He was always thinking about God. He made people feel better when they were with him. He just brought the joy of Christ to every setting he was in. But the admiration, you just don't have negative personal stories about Chesterton. They don't exist. There may be people who disagree with his writings and argue with his ideas, but what you don't find is anyone who knew him personally who had anything bad to say about him.
Mm. Well, I was going to ask you one final question, which was, what do you hope we'll learn and appreciate better about his legacy? But I almost feel that you've answered it there, that he was a saint. But if there's more to add, I'd love to hear it.
Well, I think what the book does is it does fill in a lot of the missing parts of Chesterton's life. And for those who don't know anything about Chesterton, it's certainly going to be a nice feast for them. But for those who do know about Chesterton, it not only will confirm everything they believe, but it will open their eyes to the extent of his talent, of his goodness, and of the effect he had on people around him, and why that effect continues to today.
Well, bravo, Dale, on the work of many years of your heart, and I have no doubt whatsoever that those who pick up the book will be changed by it and nourished by it. So thank you so much. The book we've been discussing, by the way, is called I Also Had My Hour, an alternative autobiography of G.K. Chesterton. It is available now from Ignatius Press. You can check it out at ignatius.com. You can also find there many other texts by and about Chesterton, including more books by Dale Ahlquist. Dale, thank you so much for taking the time to join me today.
A great blessing for me, Andrew. Thank you.